May 19, 1944. Somewhere over the Philippine Sea, the sky burns white at noon. At 22,000 feet, the air is thin and cold, sharp enough to freeze the sweat beneath a flight suit. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Nakajima banks his A6M Zero fighter through a crystalline expanse of blue, the engine humming its familiar song, a sound he has trusted for 3 years of war. Below, the Pacific stretches endlessly, a mirror of hammered silver broken only by the distant silhouettes of carriers. The radio crackles with voices, tense and clipped. Somewhere in that vastness, the Americans are coming. Nakajima breathes slowly, deliberately. His hands rest light on the stick. He has done this 100 times. 200. The Zero beneath him is an extension of his body. Responsive, agile, forgiving. It turns on a wingtip. It climbs like a sparrow. In 1942, it had been untouchable. He had watched American Wildcats try to follow him through rolls and dives, their heavier frames struggling, their pilots sweating as he circled back into their blind spots. He had returned to carriers with victory flags painted on his fuselage, had drunk sake with men who believed, truly believed, that Japan's warriors were destined to rule the sky. But that was before. Now, in the spring of 1944, something has changed. The reports filtering back from Rabaul, from the Solomons, from the scattered atolls where men died without witness, they speak of a new machine. American. Faster. Heavier. Pilots who survived encounters describe it with a kind of dread they try to mask. A fighter that does not flee, that does not stall, that follows the Zero through maneuvers it should not be able to complete. They call it the Hellcat. Nakajima has not yet faced one. Today, he will. The radio barks. Enemy fighters, 4 o'clock high. He turns his head. Sunlight glints off metal. A formation, descending in a loose combat spread. The silhouettes are unmistakable. Blunt noses, broad wings. Hellcats, 6 of them. His heartbeat quickens, but his hands remain steady. This is what he has trained for. This is what the Zero was built for. He will turn inside them. He will make them bleed energy in the turns. He will show them that skill still matters more than horsepower. He rolls into a dive, building speed, angling for the lead fighter. The distance closes. 1,000 meters. 800. The American sees him, begins his turn. Nakajima pulls back on the stick, hauling the Zero into a sharp climbing turn, expecting to see the Hellcat fall away, unable to match the angle. The Hellcat turns with him. It should not. The math does not allow it. The Hellcat weighs nearly twice as much as the Zero. It is heavier, stronger, built like a fist. But it turns. Not sluggishly. Not reluctantly. It matches his angle, degree for degree, and suddenly Nakajima realizes he is not pulling away. The American is inside his turn radius. The American is following him. Panic is a cold thing. It starts in the gut and spreads. He pushes the stick forward, trying to reverse, to unload, to escape the geometry that is closing around him like a trap. The Hellcat follows. Tracers cut through the air, white-hot lines that pass inches from his canopy. He brakes hard left, throwing the Zero into a roll so violent his vision grays. The Hellcat brakes with him. Impossible. The word repeats in his mind. Impossible. The Zero has always been superior in the turn. Always. That is the doctrine. That is the promise. The Hellcat fires again. Metal tears. His left wing shudders. Smoke pours from the engine cowling. Nakajima's hands move on instinct, reaching for the canopy release. But the fighter is already spinning, the horizon tumbling, the blue sky and the silver sea trading places in a blur. He does not remember ejecting. He does not remember the parachute opening. He remembers only the silence after the noise stops, floating in his harness, watching the wreckage of his Zero spiral down into the water far below, and seeing the Hellcat, calm, methodical, untouchable, circling once before banking away to rejoin its squadron. He is not alone in the water. Around him, other parachutes drift, other pilots, other Zeros shot down in minutes. The battle is over before it truly began. The Americans do not linger. They do not need to. They have proven their point. That night, rescued by a Japanese submarine, Nakajima sits in the cramped officer's quarters and stares at his hands. They do not shake. They should. A junior pilot, 18 years old, asks him what the Hellcat was like. Nakajima opens his mouth to answer and finds no words. How do you explain that the world you understood has ended? That the machine you trusted has been rendered obsolete not by chance, but by design? That the Americans have built something better, not just stronger, but smarter? He says nothing. The silence stretches. The young pilot looks away. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was not simply an aircraft. It was a philosophy made manifest. When it first appeared over China in 1940, it rewrote the rules of aerial combat. Range, over 1,500 miles. Maneuverability, unmatched. Climb rate, extraordinary. It could outfight anything in the sky. British Hurricanes, Soviet I-16s, American P-40s, all fell before it. Pilots spoke of it with reverence. Engineers marveled at its efficiency. The Zero embodied the Japanese principle of WWII, harmony, balance. It sacrificed armor for agility, raw power for grace. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it was a poem written in gunfire and contrails. In December 1941, Zeros escorted bombers to Pearl Harbor. They swept American fighters from the skies over the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. Allied pilots who survived encounters reported a machine that seemed to defy physics. It could turn inside anything. It could climb away from danger. It could dogfight at altitudes where other engines choked and died. For a year, the Zero reigned unchallenged. Japanese pilots grew confident, then arrogant, then complacent. They believed their superiority was inherent, a product of spirit and discipline rather than mere engineering. But the Americans were learning. Every downed Zero was studied. Every captured manual translated. Engineers at Grumman Aircraft, at Chance Vought, at Pratt & Whitney, dissected the wreckage like surgeons examining a corpse. They measured the wingspan. They weighed the components. They tested the engine. They understood what the Japanese had. Done, stripped away every unnecessary ounce to maximize agility. No armor behind the pilot's seat. No self-sealing fuel tanks. No redundancy. The Zero was a masterpiece of minimalism, and minimalism was a gamble. The Americans did not build minimalist fighters. They built tanks with wings. The Grumman F6F Hellcat entered service in early 1943. On paper, it looked inferior. It was heavier, over 12,000 pounds fully loaded, compared to the Zero's 6,000. It was less maneuverable at low speeds. It climbed slower. But the Hellcat had something the Zero did not. An engine that produced 2,000 horsepower. Thick armor plating around the cockpit. Self-sealing fuel tanks that did not explode when punctured. and, crucially, a design that allowed it to turn far tighter than its weight suggested. American engineers had learned from the Zero's strengths and exploited its weaknesses. They gave the Hellcat large, powerful ailerons that allowed rapid rolls even at high speeds. They designed the wing structure to handle extreme G-forces without warping. They built a fighter that could absorb punishment and keep flying, that could dive away from danger and climb back into the fight with energy to spare. It was not elegant. It was not poetic. It was brutally, devastatingly effective. When Hellcats first encountered Zeros in combat over the Marshall Islands in late 1943, Japanese pilots expected the usual dynamic. They would outturn the Americans. They would dictate the terms of engagement. They would win. They were wrong. The kill ratio told the story. For every Hellcat lost in combat, 19 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. 19-1. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The Zero's advantages evaporated in the face of American firepower, armor, and, most shockingly, comparable maneuverability. The Hellcat could not quite match the Zero in the tightest turns, but it came close enough. And in every other dimension of combat, it was superior. Japanese pilots, the finest in the world at the war's beginning, found themselves outmatched not by skill, but by machinery, by logistics, by an industrial base that could produce fighters by the 1,000 and pilots by the 100. The Americans did not need their pilots to be samurai. They needed them to be competent, aggressive, and supported by superior technology. The Hellcat gave them that. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai had been one of Japan's greatest aces. 64 confirmed kills, a veteran of China, of the Philippines, of Guadalcanal. He had flown the Zero since 1941 and knew its capabilities intimately. In his memoirs, written years after the war, he described the moment he first encountered a Hellcat formation over Iwo Jima in mid-1944. We climbed to intercept them, confident. We had fought Americans before. But when we engaged, everything changed. The Hellcat pilots did not flee. They turned into us. They followed us through maneuvers. One pilot stayed on my tail through a full scissors maneuver, something I had never seen an American do. I barely escaped. My wingman did not. When I returned to base, I told the squadron commander that we could no longer guarantee air superiority. He did not believe me. A week later, he was dead. Sakai's words were not hyperbole. Across the Pacific, the same pattern repeated. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the largest carrier battle of the war, Japanese naval aviation was annihilated. Over 600 Japanese aircraft were launched against the American fleet. Fewer than 100 returned. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese commanders called it a catastrophe. Hellcats and their pilots had shredded an entire generation of naval aviators in a single day. What the Japanese had expected was a fair fight. They had expected their superior training, their warrior ethos, their willingness to die for the emperor, to compensate for any material disadvantage. They had not understood that the Americans were not interested in fair fights. The Americans were interested in winning, and they had spent 2 years building the tools to do so. The Hellcat was one of those tools. But it was more than just an aircraft. It was a symbol of American industrial might, of a nation that could absorb the shock of Pearl Harbor and respond not with desperation, but with methodical, overwhelming force. The factories in Bethpage, Long Island, where Grumman built the Hellcat, operated around the clock. Workers, many of them women, many of them civilians with no prior experience, assembled fighters at a rate the Japanese could not match. In 1943 alone, Grumman delivered over 2,000 Hellcats. By war's end, the number exceeded 12,000. 12,000 Hellcats against a Japanese industry struggling to produce hundreds of replacement Zeros. The math was simple, the outcome inevitable. But numbers alone do not explain what happened in the sky over the Philippine Sea, over Iwo Jima, over Okinawa. Numbers do not explain the silence that fell over Japanese airwaves after Hellcat squadrons engaged. Numbers do not explain the despair in the letters that Japanese pilots wrote home, letters that spoke of machines they could not defeat and enemies who seemed to grow stronger with every battle. The Zero's pilots had been taught that spirit conquered matter, that discipline and training could overcome technological inferiority. For a time, it had worked. But the Hellcat did not care about spirit. It cared about thrust-to-weight ratios, about armor thickness, about ammunition capacity. It cared about giving its pilot every advantage the Zero's pilot lacked. And when those advantages were brought to bear by competent, aggressive aviators, the results were devastating. American pilots were not supermen. Many were barely 20 years old, fresh from training programs that lasted months rather than years. They did not have the thousands of hours of flight time that Japanese aces possessed. But they had the Hellcat. They had radios that worked. They had radar vectoring from their carriers. They had doctrine that emphasized teamwork over individual heroics. They had an industrial base that could replace every loss within weeks. The Japanese had courage. They had skill. They had the Zero. It was not enough. By late 1944, Japanese pilots stopped trying to dogfight Hellcats. They resorted to hit-and-run tactics, diving attacks, kamikaze runs. The proud tradition of aerial combat, of pilot against pilot in single combat, was abandoned. Not because the pilots lacked bravery, because the machine they flew could no longer compete. A Japanese naval aviator named Yasuo Kuwahara, who survived the war, later wrote, "We knew we were flying coffins. The Zero had no armor. One burst from a Hellcat's guns and you were dead. Or your fuel tank exploded, or your wing came off. But we flew anyway. What else could we do?" Surrender was not an option. So we climbed into our Zeros and hoped that today, somehow, we would be faster, smarter, luckier. We never were. The Hellcat's dominance was not solely about the aircraft itself. It was about what the aircraft represented. A nation's ability to wage industrial war on a scale that Japan could not match. The Zero had been a brilliant design for 1940. But war accelerates innovation, and the Americans innovated faster. They built better engines, better radios, better gun sights, better tactics. And they built them in quantities that rendered Japanese resistance futile. There is a photograph, taken in late 1944, of a Hellcat pilot standing beside his fighter on the deck of the USS Lexington. His name was Lieutenant David McCampbell. He would end the war as the Navy's top ace, with 34 confirmed kills. In the photograph, he is smiling. The Hellcat behind him is scarred, bullet holes stitched across the wings and fuselage. But it flew. It brought him home. It did what it was designed to do. Japanese pilots did not have the luxury of survival. Their Zeros, when hit, burned. The fuel tanks ignited. The airframe disintegrated. There was no armor to stop bullets. No redundancy to keep the engine running. The Zero had been built for a short, decisive war. When the war stretched into years, its weaknesses became fatal. The Hellcat, by contrast, could absorb astonishing damage. Pilots returned to carriers with engines shot out, wings shredded, tail sections hanging by cables. The ground crews patched them up and sent them back into the air. The Americans did not need their fighters to be perfect. They needed them to be tough, reliable, replaceable. This was the American way of war. Not elegant, not poetic, but unstoppable. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, of a Japanese pilot who crash-landed on a remote island in 1945. His Zero was beyond repair. He waited for rescue that never came. Weeks later, an American patrol found him. He was starving, delirious. They gave him water, food, medical attention. While he recovered, he asked to see the wreckage of a Hellcat that had been shot down nearby. The Americans obliged. He walked around the Hellcat slowly, running his hands over the thick armor plating, the heavy engine, the robust landing gear. He said nothing for a long time. Finally, in broken English, he spoke. "We could not build this. We did not have the steel. We did not have the factories. We did not have the time." The American officer escorting him asked if he thought the Zero was a bad design. The pilot shook his head. "The Zero was perfect for the war we thought we would fight. Fast, light, beautiful. But you did not fight that war. You fought a different war. A longer war. A war of machines and metal. And you built better machines. That was the truth the Japanese High Command refused to accept until it was too late. They had designed their strategy around a swift, decisive conflict. 6 months of victories. Force the Americans to negotiate. Secure the resources of Southeast Asia. The Zero was the sword that would win that war. But the Americans did not negotiate. They built carriers. They built fighters. They built an armada. And the sword, no matter how sharp, could not cut through steel. The numbers became grotesque. By the end of 1944, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The pilots who had bombed Pearl Harbor, who had swept through the Pacific in 1942, were dead. Their replacements were undertrained, flying outdated aircraft against an enemy that grew stronger every day. The Hellcat squadrons operated with impunity, shooting down Japanese planes in ratios that would have seemed impossible in 1942. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Hellcats destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft in a matter of days. At Okinawa in 1945, they formed an impenetrable shield around the American fleet, turning back wave after wave of kamikaze attacks. For every kamikaze that reached a ship, a dozen were shot down by Hellcat pilots who had become, by necessity, experts in deflection shooting, in high-speed interception, in the ruthless efficiency that war demands. The Japanese pilots who flew against them were no longer the elite warriors of 1941. They were teenagers with a few dozen hours of flight time, barely able to land their aircraft, sent into combat against men who had flown hundreds of missions. It was not a contest, it was a slaughter, and yet they flew. That, perhaps, is the most tragic element of the story. The Japanese pilots knew they could not win. They knew the Hellcat was superior. They knew their chances of survival were negligible. But they flew anyway because duty demanded it, because honor demanded it, because there was no alternative. A Japanese pilot named Kiyoshi Ogawa, who died in a kamikaze attack on the USS Bunker Hill in May 1945, left a letter for his family. In it, he wrote, "I do not believe I will change the course of the war, but I will do my duty. I will fly my 01 last time. If I can take even one enemy ship with me, perhaps it will matter. Perhaps not, but I will have done what was asked of me." His Zero, laden with explosives, crashed into the carrier's flight deck. The explosion killed hundreds, but the Bunker Hill did not sink. American damage control teams extinguished the fires, repaired the damage, and the carrier returned to service weeks later. Ogawa's sacrifice changed nothing. It could not. The war was already lost. The Hellcat did not win the Pacific War alone. It was one weapon among many. Carriers, submarines, bombers, the atomic bombs that ended the conflict in August 1945. But in the skies over the Pacific, it was the instrument of Japan's aerial defeat. It proved that technology, properly applied, could overcome even the most dedicated and skilled adversaries. It proved that industrial capacity mattered more than warrior spirit. It proved that wars are won not by the bravest soldiers, but by the nations that can build better tools and deploy them in greater numbers. For the Japanese pilots who faced the Hellcat, this was a bitter lesson. They had been raised to believe that willpower and discipline could overcome any obstacle. The Hellcat demonstrated with brutal clarity that this was a lie. Willpower could not stop bullets. Discipline could not repair a damaged engine. Courage could not compensate for inferior machinery. The best pilots fell silent, not because they lacked words, but because the words no longer mattered. They had trained for years to master the Zero, to exploit its agility, to turn inside any opponent. And then the Hellcat arrived, and everything they knew became obsolete. The Americans did not outturn them through superior skill. They outturned them through superior engineering. The Hellcat's wide wings, powerful engine, and robust control surfaces allowed it to match the Zero's turn rate at combat speeds, and then exceed it when the fight transitioned to high-speed maneuvering. It was humiliating. It was demoralizing. It was decisive. When the war ended, the surviving Zeros were gathered and destroyed. Some were pushed off carrier decks into the ocean. Others were burned in massive pyres. A few were preserved as trophies, displayed in American museums as relics of a defeated enemy. The Hellcat, by contrast, continued to serve for years. It flew in the Korean War. It was exported to Allied nations. It became a legend, not because it was beautiful or graceful, but because it worked. The men who flew the Hellcat spoke of it with a kind of affection rarely accorded to machines. It was reliable. It brought them home. It gave them a fighting chance when the odds were against them. They did not romanticize it. They did not write poems about its elegance. They simply flew it, fought in it, survived in it. The men who flew the Zero, those who lived, spoke of it differently, with nostalgia, with regret, with a sense of loss that transcended the personal and touched the national. The Zero had been more than an aircraft. It had been a symbol of Japan's modernity, of its ability to compete with the great powers. Its defeat was Japan's defeat. Years after the war, a former Zero pilot named Masatake Okumiya wrote, "We lost not because we lacked courage, but because we lacked steel. We lost not because our pilots were inferior, but because our nation could not produce enough aircraft to replace our losses. We lost because the Americans understood that war is not a duel between warriors, but a contest of resources and will. They had more of both. This is the truth that the Hellcat embodied. It was not the fastest fighter. It was not the most maneuverable. It was not the most beautiful. But it was good enough, in sufficient numbers, supported by an industrial base that could sustain losses and replace them within weeks. It was the fighter of a nation that understood modern war." Fade to black. The sky over the Pacific is quiet now. The contrails have faded. The gunfire has ceased. The young men who flew Zeros and Hellcats, who fought and died in machines that represented their nation's hopes and fears, are mostly gone. But the lesson remains. Technology matters. Industry matters. Logistics matter. Courage and skill and honor matter too. But they cannot substitute for superior tools wielded by a nation capable of producing them in abundance. The Zero's pilots were among the finest in the world. The Hellcat's pilots were good enough, and in the end, good enough was sufficient. The Americans built a fighter that could turn with the Zero, absorb damage the Zero could not, and be replaced when lost. They built thousands of them. They trained thousands of pilots to fly them. They deployed them across the Pacific in a campaign that ground Japanese naval aviation into dust. This was not a story of heroes and villains. It was a story of machines and the men who flew them, of nations that chose different paths and paid the price for their choices. Japan chose elegance and efficiency. America chose power and redundancy. When those philosophies collided at 20,000 feet, the outcome was never in doubt. The silence that fell over Japanese airwaves after the Hellcat arrived was not the silence of cowardice. It was the silence of men who understood that they had been rendered obsolete, that the war they had trained for was not the war they were fighting, that the machines they trusted could no longer protect them. It was the silence of realization, of defeat, of an ending that had become inevitable the moment the first Hellcat rolled off the assembly line in Bethpage and into the Pacific sky. The Zero had been a masterpiece. The Hellcat was merely effective. But in war, effectiveness is all that matters. And the Americans had built the most effective fighter of the Pacific War. The best pilots fell silent because there was nothing left to say. Fade out.